Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. It's really wonderful to see a strong turnout. We've got some fantastic minds in the room and quite a few participants online. And so I think a really nice mix of students, academics, welfare, people from welfare organisations and industry. So really important dialogue around poultry welfare today. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the unceded land of which we meet today, and that may be different from where you're joining us from online. Here, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And so I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people joining us today. There is an ongoing long history and connection of First Nations people to land, to animals and ecosystems, and the responsibility that we share in caring for them. So I think that's really important to acknowledge and setting the scene for what we'll be talking about today. I'd also like to recognise the contribution of U4, and they have co-funded Tina's seminar through the U4 Link program. If you're unfamiliar with that, a fantastic global program that's a network of representatives. I'm the Australian representative, and lots of international universities really focusing on animal welfare, education, conversation and change. So just an acknowledgement there, and there's some fantastic links online if you'd like to know more. So today's seminar brings many threads that are central to the work that we've done here at the Animal Welfare Centre and the schools across the Faculty of Science. Understanding strain differences, designing environments that work with animals rather than against them, and really importantly, translating that welfare science into meaningful change. And so we're particularly pleased to see this diverse audience, but also a fantastic speaker who hits all of those notes. Before I introduce Tina, you may not be aware, but Australians eat about 259 eggs per person per year, and most of them are brown-shelled. I'm not going to steal the thunder. Tina is going to share the science with us. Brown hens that produce brown-shell eggs. Potentially we're seeing some consumer change. And so I thought that was going to be the biggest hurdle, getting consumers to think about what's natural or not natural. But if we're going to bring white birds into the national flock in Australia, it's not as simple as just taking those birds and popping them in the same environment. So it was these discussions where Tina shared her knowledge with me, and I think it's actually perfect timing for Australians to have these conversations. So it is a real privilege to introduce Professor Tina Widowski. Tina is a Professor of Animal Behaviour and Welfare in the Department of Animal Biosciences at the University of Guelph in Canada, and a global recognised leader in poultry welfare and behaviour. Her work has shaped how we understand housing systems, strain differences, maternal behaviour, and the practicalities of improving animal welfare within commercial production systems, which is quite a challenge at times. And she's got a long-standing history with the Animal Welfare Science Centre. And so it's really fantastic. So we're on a sabbatical here in 2009 and some great connections. I met Tina 11 years ago when I was doing my PhD. And what struck me then and still does was not just her scientific rigour, but also her generosity and that support for early career researchers and that commitment to collaborative thinking. And I think that's key. Professor Widowski holds the Egg Farmers Canadian Chair in Poultry Welfare Research, and that's clearly shown about how conducting the science and then putting into policy to make that real-world change. So it's fitting that she joins us today to speak about strain differences in laying hens, a topic that challenges us to rethink assumptions and design systems that recognise meaningful biological variation. So please join me in welcoming Professor Tina Widowski.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for a very warm welcome. Melbourne holds a very, and the Animal Welfare Science Center here holds a very warm spot in my heart. And I've been here a number of times and have lots, and it's so much fun to see old friends and meet new ones and that. So, okay, let's see. Okay. So as Peter said, people have different notions about color eggs that they eat. So what color eggs do you prefer to eat? Are they brown ones? Are they white ones? Depends on where you're from in the world. There are vast differences in the color of eggs people want and expect and even will accept depending on where you live. So brown eggs are sometimes perceived as more natural. And so consumers oftentimes have this idea where it's if it's an outdoor free-range hen, the egg has to be brown. And so globally, there's a lot of regional differences in preference for egg color. In Canada and the US, most of the eggs eaten are white, except in our cage-free systems, in which they generally, until recently, are brown, because the consumer expects it cage-free, more natural. We don't have a lot of free range. I left home and it was minus 27 degrees a couple weeks ago. So there was a 50-degree difference. So free range isn't very practical where I'm from. But anyway, so the consumer expects brown eggs from cage-free systems. Now, from a producer standpoint, I think there might be producers online. I asked farmers, because I've given variations of this talk to different audiences, producer audiences and scientific audiences. And I always ask producers, well, what kind of eggs do you like to produce? Usually the ones that they're most familiar with. But so there's differences in strain differences in egg production, egg size, egg quality traits. But there's also some significant differences in feed intake and feed efficiency. So white hens are much more efficient, and from a standpoint of economics, but also environmental footprint, white hens tend to be a bit greener, okay? So because they just are much more efficient, okay? So with the change in housing systems in Canada, egg farmers are voluntarily doing away with conventional cages and are opting for enriched systems and also cage-free. We're facing major changes for the hens coming out of cages and going into these systems. And so my producers, the egg farmers of Canada, often ask, so what is the best match for a different system? So I started doing work using both brown and white hens in almost all the research that I do. And it's interesting because you always get significant differences, and the students love it because they get good p-values in their research. But also, everything we do, these birds are so different. And so I've done the last 10 years, I've done all this work on browns and whites, and then I've started to put it all together because it creates a very interesting story, actually, and to understand how these birds, if they're suited and how well they're suited to the different systems. Peter said that switching from browns to whites is not simple, but as we'll see, some of the systems that we're using today for brown hens aren't necessarily suited for their behavioral biology. And there are very distinct behavioral differences in these. And so if we're interested in matching genetic strain with the system, because it's very important for the well-being of the bird and also for the producer's bottom line, we need to understand more closely how they respond, and are we interpreting their behavior correctly if we're trying to understand their welfare. So if we think about our commercial hybrids that we use all over the world today, so you know, their ancestor was the jungle fowl, who was a terrestrial bird, mostly spends all of its time on the ground, is built to spend time on the ground, and usually only goes up into the trees at night or if there's a ground predator. Okay. Now we put them in aviaries. Is that necessarily the right thing to do? Domestication, they've been domesticated for 10,000 years or so. And there are hundreds of wild types of, or hundreds of breeds of chickens all over the world, right? But intensive selection for our commercial hybrids really only began in the 1940s or so, and mostly when hens were in conventional cages. Today's commercial hybrids, produced by basically two major companies in the world for the whole world, existing of brown hybrids and red and white commercial hybrids, are mostly derived from the Rhode Island red and the white leghorn. Okay, so there's not a lot of diversity necessarily in our commercial hybrids. So what I decided to talk about today, because I could talk to you about this for hours, because we just see so many differences and it's so interesting, is looking at differences that might affect the use of space and resources. In my role as Egg Farmers of Canada chair, I sit on our Codes of Practice Scientists Committee, and you find out that there are things we don't know about when you're trying to set codes and guidelines, and you're like, we don't know this? And so I try and direct a lot of my research at answering those questions about how do we design a system that matches the bird and does well. And so I also sit on the UEP, that's for the US, and help write the guidelines for that. So a lot of the goal of my research then is to answer questions about birds that we can use to design their housing systems. So I'm going to talk about differences in their body size and proportions and some behavioral differences in how they use space, with the idea that this should influence how we set up a nest, how we set up our systems, thinking about litter space or range, not so much range space, but if you have to close the range, litter space in the house and that sort of thing. We're looking at musculoskeletal differences and how that affects their locomotory abilities and their ability to get around, say, in an aviary system, and also some of their information on fear response and stress reactivity. People think, I heard somebody say yesterday, white birds are crazy, but we'll see that fearfulness and how they respond to fear, stimuli, is quite different between the strains. So just about everything is different about them. So if we look at, let's start out with their physique. We know brown birds are generally more heavily bodied. And so if we're thinking about space allowances, and how we come up, I know probably in your code of practice as well, you need certain amount of perch space per animal, per certain amount of feeder space per animal, as well as floor space. So for people who've not been involved in guideline development, how do we figure out how much space a bird needs? So if we look at just their static space, how big their bodies are, we can just measure them. Okay, so here's some examples about how am I going to do this? Did you say there was one of those? No, there isn't. Is there a, oh yeah, there we go. I got a okay. Can the people in Zoom see that?
I reckon you might need to use the mouse.
Oh, then I'm all covered. I'll use I'll use this. Is that okay? Because I can't see you guys. I'm behind you. I'm behind the screens if I'm back there. Okay. So this is some work out of Germany, where they're just taking photos and measuring the birds' bodies width, or they put birds in this planimetric measurement box, and you just look and can measure their how many centimeters it takes, and so developing differences from that. Another way is to look at videos of birds doing different types of movements. And so if they're standing, sitting, dust bathing, and those sorts of things, how much space do they actually need? And so when it comes to differences in browns versus whites, and this is I'm going to be referring a lot to some work done at Michigan State University in Janice Sigford's lab. And they've also done a lot of work looking at browns versus whites. And so what they're looking at is using DeKalb whites, Highline W36s, which is a strain. We don't use that in Canada. I think it's typically an American use strain. I'm not sure they use it. It's a very small bodied bird that produces a smaller egg. Their eggs are graded differently. We have the Highline Browns, which I think you guys use here, right? And Bovan Brown. Do you use Bovan? No? Okay. That's a Hendrix bird. So, all right. So anyway, if we look at using those types of measurements in the browns and the whites, we can see that the white birds They're a lighter body bird, but they're much longer and narrower. So the proportions of their bodies are quite different than the browns, who are wider and squatter. And those of us who've worked them, we know browns are wider, heavier. They have chunkier legs. But if you look, the white birds are actually longer. And what's interesting is this is just something we've noticed in the lab, is our code of practice, which we probably took from the Europeans who use all brown birds, is they say your perches should be, I don't know how many centimeters, 7 inches or something from the wall. So we set them up like that. And if you look at these white birds, they're all facing the wall. They have the code of practice amount of space, but their tails don't fit there. So they're actually, a brown bird would actually be facing outward, which is what they would prefer to do. And so, thinking about how the proportion can influence thinking about how do we design and put different features in their house. Another thing that's different is, even though the brown birds are bigger and heavier body weight and generally bigger in mass, so their chest is wider, the wingspan of a white bird is significantly greater. Okay, so she's got larger wings, and here's those 4 strains again, and we see the wingspan is greater in the white birds than it is the brown birds. So that would influence how much space they need. If we put them in an enriched system, for example, like we do in Canada, how much space, how high does it have to be? How much space do you need to allow her to perform wing flapping, for example? What we also see are some behavioral differences in how they use their space, and that is birds, browns and whites are quite different when they dust bathe. And although the white bird has a bigger wingspan, brown strains actually take up more physical space when dust bathing because they're lying down. And they have, in addition to the static space, they have a bigger personal space in their heads. So how far away do they want to be from another bird when they're dust bathing? White hens, so this is how it was measured. I was involved in this project with Tessa Grebe at MSU. And so they would take a bird who was dust bathing. These are overhead views on the litter in an aviary system. And so look at the focal animal and then measure the distances between the hens around her. Here's the same for white strains. And there's a lot on this, but basically it's what I've already said. If we look at the differences in the number of hens who are dust bathing simultaneously, the average duration of time that they dust bathe, and then the interbird distance, if we look at this, the white birds are much more tolerant of large groups. They're much more tolerant of birds being, so they're right on top of each other. So there's the minimum interbird distance. They'll be right on top of each other dust bathing. The brown birds don't tolerate that and probably stop some of their dust bathing, because if somebody gets in their way, they just stop and leave. So when we think about birds on the litter, how much space do they need? Dust bathing tends to be a synchronous activity. This could influence how we design how much litter space we need versus the system space, for example, or up on the tiers. So white hens dust bathe more synchronously and closer together. And so their personal space in their heads is also different when they're doing this activity. Another difference is their nesting or oviposition time. Now, this is from a paper. This is from, these are scientists at the Lohmann Company in Germany. So do you guys use Lohmann birds here at all? Yeah. Okay. So this is the brown layers versus white layers in terms of their timing of oviposition after the lights come on. And so as you can see here, the brown birds are tend to, here's the browns, they tend to start to lay earlier in the day, and it's more spread out. White layers, on the other hand, oviposition time is more clustered together. And what does this influence? Time spent in the nest box and how much nest space you might need. Because if everybody wants to nest at the same time, you might need more nest space and able to accommodate that, okay? So if we go back to some of the Michigan studies, they looked at in those browns and whites. So what I showed you is from Lohmann birds. These are mostly from the Hendricks Company, Okay, so the bovans and the DeKalb whites. Okay, and what you can see here is this shown here is this is nest occupancy by time of day, and then when the number of eggs laid in the nest by time of day. And you can see more browns are nesting in the morning, whereas if you look at the whites, they're spread out through the morning and the afternoon. Okay, and they tend to lay maybe more eggs in, but they also spend some less time in the nest as well. So this difference in behavior might influence how crowded the nests are, but also then maybe their tendency to lay on the floor, or what if they don't have enough nest space available. So browns are different in whites in that. So over the course of our research, we've looked also a lot at, I've done a lot of work with pullet development. And I'm interested in how rearing really influences their ability to adapt to an aviary system and cage-free. And so we've dissected and measured bones and bone strength in a lot of birds. And what we found is, you know that those brown birds are bigger and chunkier, right? And you look at their feet even, and their feet are, and their legs are just bigger and different size. If you actually dissect them, which some people won't like to do, but we've done quite a lot, is that if we look at the size of their keels and their pectoral muscles, so those are the breast muscles that work the wings, white birds have proportionally for their body weight larger keels, and the keel is the anchor for those pectoral muscles, so it's important for flight and that sort of thing. And white strains have, to go with that, is proportionally larger breast muscles. Brown strains have proportionally larger leg muscles. And because of the wing size, I showed you that the white birds had a bigger wingspan to body weight. Browns have what's called greater wing loading. So that means they got less wing for the weight that they have, which makes it more difficult maybe to get airborne. Okay, or stay airborne. And as I mentioned earlier, these are originally terrestrial birds, so they're not really flyers, but in aviary systems, they have to go up and down. We also have been measuring their feet because I've been interested in the development of perching behavior and whether they went to grass perches. And we found that, at least for these strains, DeKalb whites have longer toes than Bovan browns, and particularly with that back toe of the hallux. And so we also see that white birds tend to use the perches more as well. So their bodies are actually built for sort of different things, okay? So if we look at, you know, there's athletes, basketball players are built different than hockey players, I think. And so how does this influence their physical abilities? But we also see some tendencies in terms of behavior to influence their motivation to do different types of locomotory activities. So I showed you that whites are probably better built for at least short flights and things. And if we look at their distributions within aviary systems, this again is from Michigan State. They looked at a 3-tiered aviary during the night. And what you see is there's on the lower tier is near to the ground. The upper tier is high up, and it's very common if you work with brown and whites, you see that browns are down and whites are up. So they tend to just not only be probably physically able to do it, but also have more motivation to be in higher places as well. So they use their space within an aviary quite differently. If we look at development of perching behavior, are there little hearts going up the side of my, what's that?
Yes, it's great. Thank you.
Oh, that's from the audience? Oh, thank you. Oh, okay, great. Okay, good. And so along with using the tiers, perching, we've been looking a lot on development of perching behavior, and I showed this group some yesterday. I haven't included this. This is from older work that we looked at the development of perching behavior in 3 strains of pullets, and these were in furnished cages. They're actually the brooding compartment of aviaries, and in a rearing aviary, you start the birds in more of an enclosed section when they're little babies, and then you open those up to let them out to the litter area and those sorts of things. So these were done when they were closed. And this was, these were a Rhode Island Red, a White Leghorn, and a Columbia Rock. So these are some heritage breeds that you've heard of Shaver and Shaver birds. Don Shaver lived just down the road from the University of Guelph. And he gave us some of his birds, which there's no one paying for. I shouldn't have said that. So we keep these heritage birds. So occasionally we'll use them for research. And you can see that this is the development of percentage of pullets that are on the perches over time from 1 week to 14 weeks. And so the browns, those Rhode Island Reds, perch significantly less. I think this was nighttime roosting perhaps, as well as, and the white birds are just up and spend a lot more time. All right, so we've got flying, we've got perching. What about climbing? Other gallinaceous fowl like chuckers, that's another ground bird, use a thing called wing-assisted incline running. So when they're going up, they actually use their wings to assist in doing so, okay? So that they can get up inclines and escape from predators or go places. We've been finding that within aviary systems, and it's very well established from the European literature, that providing ramps in aviaries helps birds get to the various upper tiers and such, okay? And it also reduces injuries and keel fractures and those sorts of things. So in the study by my colleague, Alexandra Harlander, she's doing a lot of work with a biomechanics guy who studies like hummingbirds and things. And so some of the examples are really interesting. It's a very different way to look at the chicken or the laying hen. She was looking at climbing ramps and their ability to use this wing-assisted incline running as they're little. And so chicks and pullets, both browns and white strains, were trained to go up these ramps. So they were 2 different tier heights. So they had to go up 70 centimeters or up to a ramp at 160. There were food rewards or conspecifics up there to entice the birds to climb these ramps. And they tested ramps at these various inclines. And if you, so this was done over time. The birds were trained and they would see, each bird was tested on a different ramp and see if it was able to go up. And so shown here are, so she used Highline Brown, Lohman Brown, Lohman LSL Light. These are really popular in Canada, and DeKalb White. And this is the, shown here is the percent of success in these trials with climbing these ramps. And so these are 50, 60, 70 degrees. And here's the browns, and you can see they are significantly less successful at getting up those ramps at a steeper incline. Okay, and so the white birds use their wings more to get up there because they do that wing-assisted incline running. The browns tend not to do that. And so from this, we find that browns are less successful in steep ramps. And so they really need a ramp in our code of practice and others that is at a 45-degree angle is the steepest that you want it, so that they can actually walk up to get it and don't have to use their wings. So this leads us to a good idea of recommended ramp heights that'll cater to all the birds.
Why do you want them to use their wings?
Browns won't.
That's why they don't.
They won't. So that's why, see, the white birds, they'll use wing-assisted incline running more to get up to the top, and that's why they're more successful. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Alexandra's had lots of birds in training. She's been trying to train birds with this incline running to see then if they would do better later on. And what the birds who are trained on that actually have better leg muscles. So she's been looking at ways to physically train birds to do better. And so can we provide certain furnishings in an aviary system when they're in a pullet aviary system that'll actually help them build their bones and muscles when they're young? And we know when they do that, a lot of those differences, like in bone strength and that, those stay throughout their lives. So, yeah. So so she has tried training the birds, but the Browns just won't do it. All right. So, so in this, along with our interest in how do we rear birds to prepare them for this, and how can we do it differently? Should we do it differently for browns and whites? I've been looking at different aviary styles for young pullets. And as I said, when they're little, they're kept in more closed and brooding areas, but there's a lot of different styles of pullet rearing systems on the market. And some keep birds enclosed much more closely with just little perches for up maybe the first 6 weeks. And some are more an open style system, like the one you see here. This would be more similar to the Jump Start, I think. It's our version of it. And you can see that here's the little brown birds in there. But from 1 day of age, this is the brooding system. It's not really closed. Well, they're closed in from the litter. So you can see there's a wall that's closed here, and then that would be opened up to have the birds exposed to the litter. And people wait till after their 6 week vaccination, 5-6 week vaccination a lot of times, because then it's easier to handle them. But we're very interested in how this influences their ability to navigate systems and also their bones and muscles as they develop. And so we looked in commercial farms with these different types of systems. And so style 1 here is a system that's the more enclosed type. Style 2 has some elevation in it. There's higher perches. And then style 3 is the open style system. And so what I'd like to concentrate here are the strain differences. Is if you actually look at the differences, and these were on commercial farms in Alberta and Ontario in Canada, put in videos or video cameras, and then looked at mostly in this case, their aerial transitions. So how much they use their wings to go from one level to the next, going up and jumping down. So aerial transitions and then also vertical transitions. And you see that in those systems, the birds behave very differently. And so the whites are much more active. They do just more jumping and flying. We also found bone differences in that. So white birds have they reap more benefits from these systems than the brown birds do. So then we'll take it to the next step, and okay, here they're more active. We see them so does this influence how they can actually, let's put them through some tests and see how they negotiate the system. So this is work done by my former PhD student, Anna Retsch, and we reared birds in these different systems, browns and whites again, and we put them through different tests to see, can you get up here? How well can you get up here? And those sorts of things. So this first one is a hurdle test. And in this case, it's just creating a barrier and seeing if the bird can jump over that barrier or will jump over that barrier. And if you put her friends on the other side, that's usually motivation enough to go over there. Okay. And then we have another test where birds are trained to have treats, mealworms and corn and raisins in a little dish. So they learn to identify that dish, and we move the dish around and see, do they use the ramp? Do they jump up? And then this one is much more complex, where the birds are, they're trained for the red dish, and then it's like, okay, can it jump up here for the treat? Okay, how about here and then here? How about just here without going way across, okay? And so we created 5 different tasks, and in this one, the bird was started on top and had to jump down. Jumping down to a landing point seems to be the most difficult thing for the birds, okay? So if you, here's the example of, here's the hurdle test. Birds were tested at 5 weeks. This bird actually did it, but white birds were 2 times more successful and significantly faster at jumping over that. using their wings and their legs to get over it. If we look at the vertical navigation test, this is the more complicated one. These were birds in different this is conventional cages, low, medium, and this is the open style system. I'd like you to just concentrate more on the strain differences than the aviary styles. You can see that the white birds generally do better, but in that open style system, there's a combination, so there's an interaction between strain and the housing system when they're little. So the whites just learn more from being in that system and then can navigate better overall. One thing to take home is nobody does well if they're reared in conventional. So they have to have experience with being able to jump and perch and going different places in order to do different navigation. And there seems to be sensitive periods for that in their development. So it's imperative that they are reared in an enriched environment. So I mentioned to you that control during descent is it's a more difficult task. And I just wanted to show you an example of Alexandra's work with the locomotion. They use high-speed video to look at wing velocities and wing flapping and ascent and descent and those sorts of things. So this is her jump tower test, where you put birds up on the jump tower and then have her jump off. And this is what it looks like. This should start up. Here comes a white bird. Whoa, she's more upright. Whoa, it's a little bit tough even for white bird. But if you look at the brown bird, it's the different angle. Look she's like a baked potato. Oh, you want to see that again? And she has a lot more difficulty controlling her descent. But remember, her wing loading is different. And also the frequency of wing beats to get down. They're flapping a lot more, trying to control their descent. So they're quite different. So when you think about putting birds, this is an aviary system. I don't know. I pulled this off the internet. I don't know what the style is. But imagine how difficult that might be for those brown birds in that system. I don't see any ramps right there. Hopefully there's some inside. But also the distance that they need to descend without crashing. They have a large distance here from coming down onto it. But when we see a lot of those aviaries, there's not very much space between the two different sides. So to come down is quite a challenge, and particularly for those brown birds. So if we're already using these systems for brown, it's like the whites actually do better in those. Okay. Time-wise, I'm okay, right? All right. So I'm going faster. Does anybody have questions? Am I going way too fast? Because I was worried about time. No, we're good? Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit fear response and stress reactivity, because we've done some work and people think that white birds are crazy or flighty or more fearful or whatever. So we've done some work looking at fear and stress response. And the difficulty, fear tests, has anybody in here done fear tests? They're so hard. They're very sensitive to your methodology. And they're so hard to interpret, right? How are they? I see how they're acting on the outside. How are they feeling on the inside? So this was work by one of my PhD students, Mariana Peixoto, who looked at effects of maternal stress. But here we this was Lohman Company and Hendricks Company donated birds from us. So we had 2 strains of browns, a Lohman, a brown from the Lohman Company, a brown from the Hendricks Company, similar for white strains. And then we also had one of those heritage white leghorns and did a number of tests on them for looking at maternal stress. But here I'm going to concentrate on like our tests of fear and stress response in them. And so we used social isolation, tonic immobility, a looming object test, and looked at different strain differences in this. And this first test, you're going to go, what is that? It's a social isolation test in which there's, I can't remember the guy's name. This is terrible. I'm getting old. He developed this test as a measure of screening anxiolytics and depression drugs. And if you take a bird that's within the first 5 days and put it in this isolation test, and this is not, hold on. You put a bird by itself in this little box, it's basically a padded cell, and isolate them from their conspecifics, is it making you deaf? And just measure the counts. And this has been screened. So the first 5 minutes of distress vocalizations are considered to be measures of anxiety, because if you give the birds anxiolytics, it decreases it. And then later on, after the first 5 minutes, up to 15 minutes, the rate of vocalization is sort of the depressive stage. And it actually responds and has been validated with antidepressants. And so we were testing just the basic anxiety response or measure of anxious. Uh-oh. Okay, there we go. So, you don't want to hear that again. Sometimes they will respond a lot. So if we look at, this is the commercial browns, the two strains, they vocalized a lot more than the whites. And the white leghorn heritage breeds were in between. So this is the number of distress vocalizations in 5 minutes, and you can look, there's over 200 on average, hundreds of peeps. So those birds are not happy to be away from their buddies. So the brown birds, are they more anxious, or are they just more social and more upset from being apart from their social? So interpretation, but brown birds are different than whites, once again. Another test that we did was a looming novel object. So you see this, there's a person sitting, well, there's not, the person's not there. There's a chair that a person would sit on, okay? Birds were put in a box. This was alone. They'd have to walk out. And when they did, everybody uses umbrellas in behavioral science for fear tests. They had traffic cones, right? So the umbrella was the looming object. The birds come out and out. And then we look how the birds responded. Did they freeze? Did they walk? Did they fly? And if you see here, this is, so there's our two brown strains, our two white strains. There's the white leghorn. And if you look at, this is so flying. So these would be the percentage of birds that either flew, walk, or froze as their response. Okay, so there's walking, freezing, right? Flying. The brown birds freeze when they're frightened, and the white birds fly out. Okay, so the white birds are just wingier. So white birds have a reputation of being flightier. It doesn't necessarily mean they're more fearful, but their response to a fearful stimulus is different. So we think that, oh, brown birds are much calmer, but maybe they're just burning up on the inside, but we can't see it because they're freezers and not fleers. Okay. So in terms of interpreting our fear tests, we know that they respond differently. Do we know if they feel differently on the inside? I don't know. Another very common test that we do is tonic immobility. Who in here has done a tonic immobility test? Yeah. How do you like them? They're hard to do. Everybody does them. I'm not convinced. Do you feel the same way? Yes? Okay. So this is for those of you who don't know birds and tonic immobility, this is a test for death feigning, and a number of animals, other animals besides chickens, do tonic immobility, and you put them on their back. Sometimes you can use a cradle like this. Sometimes you just put them right on the floor, and they go into this hypnotic type state called tonic immobility. And during that, there's a number of physiological changes that people measured back in the 80s. Their heart rates reduce and those sorts of things. And the way they're interpreted is longer durations mean more fear. Now, typically, oh, I won't tell you that yet. Okay, so when Mariana did this, we found that brown birds had longer tonic immobility. So does this mean they're more fearful than the white birds? But then when we looked at the literature, this is not how it's supposed to be. White birds are supposed to be more fearful. We know they're more flighty. They're also supposed to do differently in a tonic immobility test. So later, Anna Wrench did this meta-analysis comparing white and brown egg layers. And she compared the literature for tonic immobility and novel object tests. And I don't know what I have. In general, what she found that white birds used to be more fearful. If you look at the literature from like the 80s, or I can't remember the decades. So decade was significant in her meta-analysis. Whites used to have longer tonic immobility. So either the birds have changed over the decade, or if you actually look at the methods used in the papers, people started cutting them off at 10 minutes. In the old literature, people would let it go for longer. So when you've done it, what was your cutoff? You know, right? 10 minutes, okay? In the old days, people had more patience or something, right? And they let the tonic immobility go longer, and the white birds would stay in it for longer. So we don't know from this meta-analysis whether the birds have changed or whether just the methodology has changed. And so you can see that these types of fear tests are really sensitive to the methods that you use and whether you use that Bradle or not and those sorts of things. From the meta-analyses of novel object tests, and this is the type of novel object where you, rather than a looming thing like the umbrella going at them, it's just putting a novel object, and brown hens generally approach it more slowly, okay, compared to whites. So their fear response is the type of stimuli that they're afraid of. White hens usually are more wary around people. So we haven't done it, but in human approach tests, white hens tend to flee more. And you walk through the barn of browns, and most of them are dropping at your feet in a sexual crouch, which is a real hassle to walk through, right? But white birds will tend to flee away. But maybe those birds are actually freezing. All right. And so what we know is these birds are different. They're sensitive to different types of stimuli, humans versus novel objects, and their way that they physically respond are different. Okay. So is one more fearful than the other? I don't know. I don't know how they feel on the inside. Stress response is also a little bit tricky. This is back to Mariana's work. And this is a test. Hold on. It's got to show up. There it is. All right. What do you think that is? Chicken in a bag. All right. So this is a restraint test that's done for HbA activity. So to see, so you put a chicken in a bag. And so first you take a baseline blood sample quite quickly before she has a chance to have elevated corticosterone. Then you remove her from the bag at 10 minutes, take another blood sample, which is the the max of the stress response. And then 20 minutes after that, you put her back in the bag and then take her out and take another blood sample. And so it's 30 minutes in total. I'm almost there. And so if you look at the HbA response, brown birds are down here. White birds appear to be more stressed, or their stress response is just different. If you look at the literature in terms of heterophil lymphocyte ratio, brown birds generally have a higher heterophil lymphocyte ratio than white birds, which is many people would interpret brown birds are more stressed. So you have to be really careful in using these measures and trying and interpret. So as I said, Venus and Mars, these birds are like from different planets. They're built differently. White birds are built to fly, built to go up. They have the motivation to go up. They learn to do so much more readily. They have the physique to do it as well. And because of that, they take up different amounts of space, and they use the space that we give them in their housing system quite differently. We don't have brown aviaries and white aviaries. We have aviaries, and we put both kind of birds in those, right? Browns probably do better in aviaries that are more forgiving, where they don't have to go up and down so much. Browns are vertically challenged, both in their bodies and in their minds. Okay, so they don't necessarily want to go up and have more difficulty doing so, probably because the way they're built. And as well, these birds are fearful of different things, and they respond differently when they have a fear response. So we have to think about that. A lot of what we think we know about chickens was done with only one type of strain or another. So if you look in the old literature, this is what we know. This is what chickens do. In a lot of the old literature, it was all in brown strains. And we might, if we went back and revisited that, what we think we know about the chicken might be completely different depending on what strain that we use. So matching genetic strain with system, I think it's really important to look at this and to think about how to design systems that actually match their behavioral biology and their bodies. That's it. And these are various people who have provided money to do all these studies over the years, and I thank them and I thank you guys.
Thank you, Tina. How brilliant and silly we are with our umbrellas and all sorts of crazy things, but the importance of interpretation clearly comes with lots of expertise. I think we've probably all got a lot of questions, but we're running out a little bit of time.
Quick one online.
Yes.
Do you want me to use?
I reckon the mic's above, but if you could repeat the
So
question.
there's a question from Ronald Watt asking, in Australia, we primarily have highlines, commercial brown variety laying brown shell eggs. I find they are incredibly colorous and will not welcome any other fowl unless they are also brown. Do you know if this is also the case with European commercial browns and other types?
Okay, the question is, birds are colorist, they are racist, yes. I know a lot of people find that even in some backyard flocks, and I think some of it has to do with experience and what they've grown up with. I've started playing around research-wise with actually rearing together mixed flocks. So to see how much of this is just their natural tendency, and can you change their behavior by influencing it with the other strain. There's only been a handful of studies who've done that. And we've looked at that they tend to hang together more if they're reared. So I think a lot of that is just what they've been exposed to since they were babies. If you do rear them separately, they don't hang around together. I do know that in Europe, sometimes they have mixed flocks, and you can get a carton of eggs with a mixture of browns and whites in them. So I think a lot of that depends on their experience, the rearing experience when they're young.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tina. I'm sure we've got lots of questions, but clearly the impact of early life experience and strain, and looking at some of this research that we've done and how quickly these strains shift over time as well. So I'm sure we've got lots of questions and we can continue having this conversation offline, I think, but unless we've got any burning questions in the audience. Oh.
Close out?
Huh?
So if when you're picking the birds at close out, if they're going to go to processing, it must be a bugger if the white ones fly away from you and the brown ones will breed. So there must be different strategies.
They do them at night. They do catching at night and wear blue lights on there. So all the catching is done in the dark. Yeah. So, and it's a challenge, definitely, particularly in aviary systems to catch out the birds. But they'll do it in the dark.
Megan.
So you mentioned that there's differences in the way that they respond to fear, where the brown birds are more likely to freeze and the white birds are more likely to be flighty and move away. Does that have any impact on abnormal behaviours like piling behaviour?
Who knows? I don't know if I don't know if we know enough about piling. Piling is one of those behavior problems that it's still early days and, right?
Yeah. There is some research that shows differences in the way they pile between the white strains and the brown strains. Females with some years ago.
Mhm. The way they pile, do we even know the
The
incident?
duration and the frequency of the white birds pile for less duration, but they were more frequent, whereas the brown birds would pile for longer duration and less frequent.
I'm wondering if they're, well, the white birds probably might be more agile at getting out of a pile potentially.
Yeah.
But I wonder if, because their personal space when dust bathing and things like that.
And perhaps the sort of freezing behaviour of the brown bird keeps them in the pile, especially if they're being restrained sort of wings against the body.
Right.
They might just get in there and fall into a talking ability.
So maybe different reasons why they pile, but also why they smother, because not
That's
every
right.
pile results in a smother. So
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know if one type versus another has greater tendency to smother versus another. But you also brought up a good point, because one of the things in aviaries, if white birds are flightier when they're afraid, then you have a tendency to have them do those bird explosions, right? When you're going through an aviary and everyone like explodes, the white birds might tend to do that. And I think knowing that, it's probably more important to provide human contact and enrichment while they're being reared, to habituate them to that so that they're less fearful. Making them less fearful might be more important, because they'll do those bird explosions and fly more in them. So there's a lot of implications in knowing it, because everyone thinks, oh, white birds, so they're just different, you know?
yes, well, I've certainly had a lot of my assumptions challenged today, which is the beauty of seeing, so much research in a variety of ways, and what their experience is, and trying to understand the bird's experience, but what that also means for people who are managing them as well.
Yeah. Also, people have said, well, browns and whites are different, but within strains within brown birds and within white birds are also different. So there's individual differences in strains within the color phenotype as well. And we can see a lot of that. So it's like, don't generalize. But in some ways, it's like Janice Sigford's group and our group, we've used more than one type of brown, and it's kind of mind-boggling how you get them to be the same and they don't see each other, and there's more like that, and so it's very interesting
and so important. And putting science into policy is never easy, and now it's just even more complicated in my mind. So
I know.
But we will continue some conversations, and so we can have this offline. But we are running out of time, so I just want to really thank Tina for coming to see us again in Melbourne, and we hope it's not too long for your next visit, and for sharing all that amazing information with us. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks. Thank you.
And so I'll wrap up the seminar for today. Thank you for those participating online and in person. We will work through the recording. I'm sure this will be available online, but please do reach out. Keep an eye on LinkedIn. Thank you to Surya, who's doing all the tech things that, some people understand, not me. Thank you for your support. And of course, Animal Welfare Science Centre and Mia Cobb, who's doing all the behind the scenes things in particular for this one. So thank you. And we hope to see you at the next one.